Het paard, tot dan toe kalm, werd oncontroleerbaar bij het zien van haar. Zijn reactie was niet die van angst, maar van een terreur die een donker geheim leek te verbergen. De ochtendzon wierp lange schaduwen over de glooiende heuvels van Utrecht, terwijl Sophie Jansen bij het hek van haar trainingsbaan stond, haar ogen gericht op het prachtige volbloedpaard dat voor haar galoppeerde. Thor, met zijn glanzende kastanjebruine vacht en krachtige passen, belichaamde alles waar ze de afgelopen 10 jaar voor had gewerkt. Toen het paard de laatste bocht naderde, zijn hoeven amper de grond rakend, liet Sophie zich een kleine glimlach ontvallen. Over slechts 3 dagen zouden ze hun grootste uitdaging tot nu toe aangaan, de Nederlandse derby. If this story caught your attention, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching us from. Stay tuned. The grandfather clock in the corner struck midnight, its deep chimes reverberating through the empty halls. Ethan swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass, watching as the firelight danced through it, creating patterns that reminded him of happier times. Times when laughter used to fill these halls, when the pitter-patter of small feet would echo through the corridors. Now all that remained was silence. The isolation of his mountain retreat had become both his sanctuary and his prison. The successful businessman had everything money could buy, yet the void in his heart remained unfillable. After the tragic accident that changed his life forever, he had retreated from the world, finding solace in the solitude of his mountain estate. The social circles that once clamored for his attention now existed only in fading memories. A sudden sound broke through his melancholic reverie, faint yet persistent enough to draw his attention away from the hypnotic dance of the flames. At first, he dismissed it as another trick of the wind, which had been particularly fierce that evening. But there it was again, a sound that seemed out of place in the symphony of winter's fury. Ethan rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. The sound grew clearer as he approached the massive front door of his mansion. It wasn't the wind. This was different, almost like a whimper. His hand hesitated on the doorknob as memories of his past life flashed through his mind, memories of times when he would have rushed to help without a second thought. The bitter cold hit him like a physical blow as he opened the door. The snow had piled up against the entrance, creating a white wall that sparkled under the porch lights. The sound was clearer now, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond. Ethan grabbed his coat from the hook by the door and stepped out into the night. His boots crunched through the fresh snow as he followed the sound, his breath creating clouds in the frigid air. The security lights cast long shadows across the pristine white landscape, and for a moment, Ethan questioned his own sanity. What was he doing out here in the middle of a freezing night? Then he saw it, a small dark shape against the snow, barely visible in the dim light. As he drew closer, his heart began to race. There, partially covered by the falling snow, lay a bear cub, its tiny body trembling from the cold. The creature was barely moving, its breaths coming in shallow gasps that created small clouds in the freezing air. Ethan's mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Every logical part of his brain screamed about the dangers of approaching a wild animal, especially a bear. Where was its mother? Was this some kind of trap? But something else, something deeper, something he thought he had lost long ago, pushed him forward. The cub was nearly frozen, its fur encrusted with ice. Without further hesitation, Ethan removed his coat and carefully wrapped it around the small creature. The bear cub offered no resistance, too weak to even protest, as Ethan lifted it gently into his arms. Its body was cold, desperately cold, and Ethan could feel the faint trembling against his chest. As he carried the cub back toward the warmth of his mansion, memories of another time when he had cradled something precious in his arms flooded his mind. The weight in his arms felt different, yet somehow familiar, awakening feelings he had buried deep within his soul. The wind continued to howl around them, but Ethan barely noticed it now, focused entirely on the small life he held. Inside the mansion, the warmth enveloped them like a protective embrace. Ethan moved quickly to the fireplace, his mind already formulating a plan. He needed to warm the cub, gradually, carefully. As he began to gently rub the frozen fur, trying to restore circulation, the cub's eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting his gaze with a look that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. The first rays of dawn crept through the frost-covered windows, casting long shadows across the mansion's living room. Ethan hadn't slept, his attention fixed on the small bundle of fur near the fireplace. Throughout the night, he had maintained a vigil, carefully monitoring the bear cub's breathing and ensuring the fire never dimmed. His expensive Persian rug now served as a makeshift bed for the unexpected guest, but Ethan couldn't have cared less about material possessions at that moment. As morning light filled the room, the cub began to show more signs of life. Its breathing had become stronger, more regular, and occasionally it would stir, making small movements that sent waves of relief through Ethan's tired body. He had spent hours researching on his tablet, trying to learn everything he could about caring for orphaned bear cubs. The information was overwhelming, filled with warnings and cautions, but he couldn't bring himself to contact the authorities. Not yet. The cub's eyes opened fully for the first time since he'd brought it inside. They were dark and intelligent, filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Ethan remained perfectly still, barely breathing, as the small creature took in its surroundings. The cub attempted to stand, but stumbled, its legs still weak from the ordeal. Without thinking, Ethan reached out to steady it, and to his surprise, the cub didn't flinch away from his touch. "Easy there, little one," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. When was the last time he had spoken aloud to another living being? The cub turned toward his voice, tilting its head slightly as if trying to understand. In that moment, something shifted inside Ethan's chest, a feeling he had thought was lost forever. He prepared a mixture of warm milk and honey, following the instructions he'd found online for emergency care of young bears. The cub was hesitant at first, but hunger eventually overcame fear, and it began to lap eagerly at the offered sustenance. Ethan found himself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in what felt like years. As the morning progressed, the cub grew stronger, taking tentative steps around the fireplace area. Ethan watched in fascination as it explored its new environment, its natural curiosity beginning to overcome its initial weakness. The bear's presence had already begun to transform the cold, silent mansion into something else entirely. Rooms that had been closed off for months were now filled with the sound of clumsy paw steps and occasional squeaks of discovery. Ethan spent the day alternating between caring for the cub and watching it sleep. He knew he should contact wildlife services, but something held him back. The thought of surrendering this unexpected connection to the authorities made his chest tighten uncomfortably. Instead, he found himself making lists of supplies he would need: proper milk replacer, vitamins, blankets. As evening approached, Ethan noticed the cub watching the falling snow through the window. Its small paws pressed against the glass, tracking the movement of snowflakes. The sight triggered a memory of another small hand pressed against window panes, another innocent being fascinated by nature's display. The parallel wasn't lost on him, and for once the memory didn't bring only pain. "Hope!" he said suddenly, surprising himself. The cub turned at the sound of his voice, and Ethan realized he had just named it. "That's what I'll call you, Hope." The name felt right, somehow fitting for this small creature that had literally stumbled into his life and was already beginning to thaw something frozen inside him. That night, Ethan made up a bed for Hope using soft blankets near the fireplace, but the cub had other ideas. As Ethan settled into his armchair to keep watch, Hope wobbled over and curled up at his feet. The simple act of trust from this wild creature touched something deep within him, and he found himself fighting back tears. The mansion's security system beeped softly, alerting him to movement outside. On the monitors, Ethan could see fresh snow falling, covering any tracks that might have been left from the previous night. He found himself wondering about Hope's mother, about what circumstances had led to the cub being alone in the snow. The thought of another parent experiencing loss made his heart ache in familiar ways. As the night deepened, Ethan began to notice subtle changes in his surroundings. The mansion, which had for so long felt like a mausoleum of memories, seemed to be awakening from its own winter slumber. The presence of Hope had brought something new into these halls, not just life, but possibility. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself thinking about tomorrow with something other than dread. But as Hope slept peacefully at his feet, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this peace was temporary. Something told him that the real challenges were yet to come, that this was just the beginning of a journey that would test him in ways he couldn't imagine. Outside, the wind continued to howl, carrying with it secrets of the wilderness that would soon make themselves known. Days melted into weeks as Ethan and Hope settled into an unexpected routine. The mansion, once a monument to solitude, now echoed with the sounds of life. Hope's growing confidence led to amusing adventures, from sliding down the polished wooden stairs to investigating every corner of the vast residence. Ethan found himself child-proofing rooms he hadn't entered in years, rediscovering forgotten spaces as he secured valuable items from curious paws. Each morning began with Hope's eager anticipation of breakfast, the cub's playful impatience bringing a warmth to Ethan's heart that he had almost forgotten existed. He had perfected the art of preparing Hope's special formula, watching with satisfaction as the young bear grew stronger and more energetic with each passing day. The frozen, barely breathing creature he had found in the snow seemed like a distant memory. However, as February's harsh winds continued to howl around the mansion, Ethan began noticing subtle changes in the environment outside. It started with small things, branches arranged in unusual patterns near the property line, marks on trees that seemed too deliberate to be random. At first, he dismissed these signs, attributing them to the natural movements of wildlife in the area. One particularly cold morning, as Ethan went to check the security cameras, something caught his eye. Near the eastern fence, where the property met the dense forest, he spotted unusual tracks in the snow. These weren't Hope's playful paw prints or the usual marks left by local wildlife. These were larger, more purposeful. His heart rate quickened as he zoomed in on the footage, studying the systematic way whatever had left those tracks had moved along the perimeter of his property. Inside, Hope seemed oblivious to Ethan's growing concern, happily exploring a new toy, a large rubber ball that Ethan had ordered specially for him. The cub's playful antics provided a welcome distraction from the unsettling discoveries outside. Watching Hope chase the ball across the floor, occasionally getting it stuck under furniture and looking to Ethan for help, made it easy to forget about the mysterious signs beyond the mansion's walls. Yet the evidence continued to mount. During his daily check of the grounds, Ethan discovered fresh claw marks on trees near the garage, higher up than Hope could reach. The marks seemed to form a pattern, as if marking territory. His research into bear behavior suggested this was common, but the proximity to the house was unusual. The wildlife guides he'd been studying all emphasized that bears typically avoided human dwellings unless attracted by food or some other compelling reason. Hope's behavior began to change subtly as well. The cub, usually content to play inside or explore the immediate vicinity of the house during their supervised outdoor time, started showing increased interest in the forest's edge. During their afternoon walks, Hope would often pause, nose lifted to the wind, as if catching a familiar scent. These moments would pass quickly, but they left Ethan with an unsettling feeling. One evening, as Ethan prepared Hope's dinner, he heard a sound that made him freeze, a deep, distant rumble carried on the wind. It wasn't thunder. The sound was too organic, too primal. Hope, who had been dozing near the fireplace, immediately perked up, ears forward and alert. The cub's reaction confirmed Ethan's suspicions. Something out there was trying to communicate. That night, Ethan spent hours reviewing security footage, scanning every camera angle for signs of what might be lurking in the shadows of his property. The screens showed only swaying trees and drifting snow, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. He found himself zooming in on dark spaces between trees, searching for shapes that might explain the growing number of signs he'd been finding. Hope seemed more restless than usual, pacing between windows and occasionally letting out soft whimpers. Ethan had never seen the cub so agitated. As he watched Hope's unusual behavior, a realization began to dawn on him. Perhaps these weren't just random occurrences. Perhaps something or someone was searching for what they had lost. The thought brought with it a complex mix of emotions. Ethan had grown deeply attached to Hope, finding in their daily interactions a purpose he had been missing for so long. The idea of any threat to this new relationship filled him with anxiety. Yet, as he watched Hope press a paw against the cold window glass, staring intently into the darkness beyond, he couldn't ignore the growing evidence that their peaceful routine might soon be disrupted. Late that night, after Hope had finally settled down to sleep, Ethan sat in his study reviewing his options. The stack of wildlife guides on his desk seemed to mock him with their simple solutions. Contact authorities, maintain distance, avoid interaction. None of these books had chapters about what to do when a bear cub steals your heart, or how to protect a relationship that defied natural laws. Outside, the wind carried new sounds into the night, and Ethan couldn't help but wonder if they were messages meant for Hope. The arrival of March brought subtle changes to the mountain landscape. The iron grip of winter began to loosen, though patches of stubborn snow still clung to the shadowed corners of Ethan's property. Hope had grown considerably over the past weeks, his playful energy filling the mansion with a vitality that had been absent for far too long. The bear cub's presence had transformed not just the physical space, but Ethan himself, breathing life back into corners of his heart he thought had been sealed forever. During their morning routine, as Ethan prepared Hope's breakfast, he noticed the cub's unusual fixation on the kitchen window. Hope stood on his hind legs, pressing both paws against the glass, completely still except for his nose, which twitched rapidly as he processed scents that Ethan couldn't detect. This behavior had become more frequent lately, and each time it happened, Ethan felt a slight tightening in his chest. "What do you see out there, buddy?" Ethan murmured, moving to stand beside Hope. The forest beyond the window looked peaceful enough, the morning sun casting long shadows through the trees. But something had caught Hope's attention, something that made the young bear more alert than usual. Ethan had learned to trust these moments of focused attention. They usually meant something was stirring in the wilderness beyond his property. Later that afternoon, while Hope napped in his favorite spot by the fireplace, Ethan decided to investigate the perimeter of his property. The security cameras had been picking up more movement lately, though they never seemed to capture anything definitive. As he walked the grounds, he noticed new markings on the trees near the eastern fence, fresh claw marks that seemed to have appeared overnight. The marks were different from anything he'd seen before. They were deliberate, forming patterns that spoke of purpose rather than random scratching. Ethan's research into bear behavior had taught him that such markings often served as communication between bears, but these seemed unusually concentrated around his property. As he studied the marks, a sudden gust of wind carried a strange scent, musky and wild, that made him instantly alert. Back inside the mansion, Ethan found Hope awake and unusually agitated. The cub paced between windows, letting out soft whimpers that tugged at Ethan's heart. This was new behavior, and it concerned him. Hope had always been curious about the outside world, but this seemed different, more urgent, more focused. The cub's actions reminded Ethan of someone searching for something they couldn't quite reach. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape, Ethan sat in his study, reviewing the security footage from the past week. Hope lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head at sounds only he could hear. The monitors showed the usual array of winter wildlife: deer moving cautiously through the trees, foxes darting across the snow, but something about the patterns of movement seemed off. Ethan noticed that the other animals appeared to be giving certain areas of his property a wide berth, as if avoiding something. He zoomed in on one particular section of footage, where the snow had been disturbed in a way that suggested something large had been watching the mansion. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. They were being observed. A sudden crash from downstairs broke through his concentration. Ethan rushed to find Hope, standing near the back door, more animated than he'd seen him in days. The cub's attention was fixed on something outside, his whole body tense with excitement or fear. Ethan couldn't tell which. Through the glass door, he could see fresh tracks in the snow, leading away from the house and into the darkness of the forest. Hope pressed against the door, letting out a sound that was neither a growl nor a whimper, but something in between. Ethan found himself torn between the instinct to protect Hope and the growing awareness that something significant was happening. The tracks outside seemed to tell a story he was only beginning to understand. That night, as a late winter storm howled around the mansion, Ethan made a decision. He needed to understand what was happening around his property. The increasing signs of activity, Hope's changing behavior, and his own growing unease could no longer be ignored. Tomorrow, he would begin a more thorough investigation of the forest surrounding his home. As he prepared for bed, Ethan noticed Hope sitting by the window in his bedroom, silhouetted against the moonlight. The cub's posture was alert, ears forward, as if listening to voices carried on the wind. Looking at Hope's reflection in the window, Ethan realized that their peaceful routine was beginning to shift. Something was stirring in the wilderness beyond his walls, something that would soon force both of them to confront realities they weren't quite ready to face. The morning brought an unusual stillness to the mountain landscape. Ethan woke early, his mind filled with plans for investigating the mysterious signs around his property. Hope was already awake, watching the sunrise from his favorite spot by the living room window. The bear cub had grown significantly over the past weeks, his once fragile frame now solid and strong, though he still maintained the playful demeanor that had first endeared him to Ethan. During breakfast, Ethan noticed Hope's increasing restlessness. The cub would eat a few bites, then move to different windows, his behavior suggesting he sensed something beyond the mansion's walls. Ethan had learned to read these subtle changes in Hope's demeanor, understanding that the young bear's instincts often perceived things human senses couldn't detect. After their morning routine, Ethan decided to begin his investigation. He equipped himself with a high-resolution camera and a notebook, determined to document everything he found. Hope followed close behind as they stepped out into the crisp mountain air, the cub's presence both comforting and concerning. Every few steps, Hope would pause, nose lifted to the wind, processing information that remained invisible to Ethan. Their exploration led them to the eastern section of the property, where the recent tracks and markings had been most concentrated. In the daylight, Ethan could see details he'd missed before. The claw marks on the trees weren't random. They followed a pattern, ascending to specific heights and appearing at regular intervals. As he photographed these markings, Hope's behavior became increasingly animated. The cub moved with purpose toward a cluster of pine trees near the property line. Ethan followed, camera ready, but what he found stopped him in his tracks. Hidden among the trees was a collection of broken branches arranged in a distinct pattern. The formation was too deliberate to be natural, yet too complex to be human-made. Hope approached the arrangement carefully, sniffing each branch as if reading a message. As Ethan documented the discovery, a sound echoed through the trees, a deep, resonant call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Hope froze, ears perked forward, body tense with attention. The call came again, closer this time, and Hope took a few steps toward the forest before catching himself and looking back at Ethan with what seemed like confusion. The moment was interrupted by the sudden appearance of a large shape moving through the trees at the edge of the property. Ethan's heart raced as he quickly gathered Hope close, ready to retreat to the safety of the mansion. But the shape didn't approach. It merely observed from the shadows before melting back into the forest. Hope whimpered softly, straining slightly against Ethan's protective hold. Back inside the mansion, Ethan spent hours reviewing the photos he'd taken, comparing them with his research on bear behavior. The patterns he discovered were fascinating and troubling. The markings suggested not just presence, but communication. Complex messages left in a language he was only beginning to understand. Hope remained unusually quiet throughout the afternoon, alternating between watching the forest through windows and staying close to Ethan's side. That evening, as they sat in the study, Ethan noticed something new in Hope's behavior. The cub seemed torn, displaying an internal conflict that manifested in restless pacing and confused looks between Ethan and the windows. It was as if Hope was struggling to reconcile two different worlds: the safe, loving environment of the mansion and the mysterious call of the wild that grew stronger each day. As night fell, the security system captured more movement along the property's perimeter. The cameras showed shadows moving with purpose, leaving new marks and signals in the snow. Hope watched the security monitors with intense focus, recognizing something in those moving shapes that Ethan could only guess at. The bond between them felt both stronger and more fragile than ever, as if balanced on the edge of an inevitable change. In his dreams that night, Ethan found himself walking through an endless forest, following traces of Hope's paw prints in the snow. The prints led him deeper into the wilderness, where shadows danced between trees and distant calls echoed through the branches. He woke with a start, finding Hope sitting beside his bed, watching him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold secrets of both worlds. The next morning brought new discoveries. Fresh tracks circled the entire property, creating a pattern that suggested protective behavior rather than threat. Hope's reaction to these new markings was different, less anxious, more curious. As Ethan photographed the tracks, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into something larger than themselves, a story that had been unfolding in these mountains long before Hope had found his way to Ethan's door. The early spring sunshine filtered through the mansion's windows, casting warm patches of light across the wooden floors where Hope lazed contentedly. The bear cub had developed a habit of following these sunny spots throughout the day, moving from window to window as the sun traced its path across the sky. Ethan watched this daily ritual with a mixture of joy and growing concern, aware that each passing day brought changes he couldn't quite understand. During their morning walk around the property, Ethan noticed Hope's increased attention to certain areas of the forest edge. The cub would pause at specific points, head tilted as if listening to distant conversations. These moments had become more frequent, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were part of a larger pattern he was struggling to decipher. The security cameras had captured more unusual activity overnight. Reviewing the footage, Ethan observed what appeared to be a systematic patrol of his property's boundaries. The moving shapes were careful to stay just within the camera's range, as if deliberately leaving evidence of their presence. Hope watched the security monitors with unprecedented focus, occasionally touching the screen with his paw when certain shadows appeared. Later that afternoon, while Hope napped in his favorite spot by the fireplace, Ethan received an unexpected email from a local wildlife expert. The message spoke of increased bear activity in the area and advised residents to take precautions. What caught Ethan's attention wasn't the warning itself, but the expert's description of unusual bear behavior patterns being observed throughout the region. The email mentioned bears exhibiting complex social behaviors previously undocumented in the area. There were reports of organized movements, sophisticated communication through markings, and what appeared to be coordinated actions between different groups of bears. The expert's tone was one of fascination rather than concern, but Ethan couldn't help connecting these observations to the strange events around his property. As he read deeper into the expert's findings, Hope suddenly became alert, ears perked forward and body tense. A sound, too faint for human ears, had caught the cub's attention. Ethan moved to the window, following Hope's gaze. At first, he saw nothing unusual in the forest beyond his property. Then a subtle movement caught his eye, a deliberate shifting of shadows that seemed to carry meaning. Hope's reaction was immediate and complex. The cub approached the window with a mixture of excitement and hesitation, pressing both paws against the glass. The sound came again, clearer this time, a series of soft vocalizations that made Hope tremble with recognition. Ethan watched as emotions he didn't know bears could express played across Hope's features. That evening, as they sat in the study, Ethan began mapping out the patterns of activity he'd observed around his property. He created a detailed timeline, noting each new marking, track pattern, and unusual behavior. When laid out chronologically, the evidence suggested something more organized than random wildlife movements. The bears weren't just passing through. They were establishing a presence, creating a network of communication around the mansion. Hope's behavior had shifted subtly as well. The playful cub still enjoyed their daily routines, but there was a new awareness in his actions. He spent more time watching the forest, responding to sounds and movements that Ethan couldn't detect. During their afternoon walks, Hope would lead them to specific trees, waiting patiently as Ethan examined the new markings that appeared with increasing frequency. As night fell, the security system detected movement near the eastern perimeter. On the monitors, Ethan watched as a large shape emerged from the forest, moving with deliberate grace. It approached one of the marked trees, rising on its hind legs to add new scratches to the existing pattern. Hope, watching from Ethan's side, let out a soft sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a call, but something in between. The evening's discoveries left Ethan with more questions than answers. He found himself studying Hope's reactions, trying to read the unspoken understanding that seemed to pass between the cub and the mysterious visitors. The bond they had formed over the past months felt both stronger and more complex with each new development. Before bed, Ethan took one last walk through the mansion, checking windows and security systems. Hope followed close behind, their footsteps echoing through the quiet halls. At each window, the cub would pause, as if comparing the safety of their shared home with the growing call of the wilderness beyond. The night wind carried new sounds, soft growls, distant movements, the rustle of leaves, each one a piece of a conversation Ethan was only beginning to understand. As March progressed, the dynamic between Ethan and Hope grew increasingly complex. Their morning routines, once filled with simple joy and playful interactions, now carried an undercurrent of something deeper. Hope's eyes held a new awareness, a growing understanding that seemed to weigh heavily on the young bear's consciousness. Ethan found himself studying these subtle changes, trying to decode the silent messages that passed between them. The mansion's atmosphere had shifted as well. Rooms that had once felt like safe havens now seemed to pulse with an energy that connected them to the wilderness beyond. Hope spent hours at different windows, his behavior suggesting he was keeping watch rather than merely observing. Sometimes he would rush from one window to another, tracking movement only he could perceive, his actions becoming more purposeful with each passing day. During their afternoon walks, Ethan noticed Hope's growing hesitation at the property's boundaries. The cub would pause at invisible lines, pacing back and forth as if testing the limits of his two worlds. These moments of indecision touched something deep within Ethan's heart. He recognized the struggle of being caught between different lives, different loyalties. One particularly quiet afternoon, as sunshine streamed through the study's windows, Ethan witnessed a scene that crystallized his growing concerns. Hope sat before the large bay window, watching a pair of ravens interact in the garden. The birds seemed to be performing an elaborate dance, exchanging objects and moving in synchronized patterns. Hope's attention was absolute, his body tense with focus as he absorbed this display of wild communication. The security cameras continued to capture increasing activity around the property. The mysterious visitors no longer seemed content to remain in the shadows. Their movements became more bold, more deliberate. They left signs that even Ethan could interpret. Broken branches arranged in patterns, marks on trees that formed complex messages, and tracks that created deliberate paths around the mansion's perimeter. Hope's reactions to these signs became more pronounced. The cub would spend hours investigating new markings, his behavior suggesting he understood messages that remained invisible to human eyes. During these investigations, Hope would occasionally look back at Ethan with an expression that seemed to carry both love and apology, as if aware of the growing tension between his domestic life and his wild heritage. Inside the mansion, evidence of Hope's internal struggle manifested in small ways. His favorite toys lay untouched more often, while natural objects, pine cones, branches, and leaves that blew in through open windows, became sources of intense fascination. He began creating his own arrangements of these items, mimicking the patterns they discovered outside, as if practicing a language he was beginning to remember. Ethan found himself spending more time in his study, researching bear behavior and communication. The complex social structures being revealed in recent wildlife studies seemed to confirm his observations. Bears weren't just solitary creatures meeting by chance. They maintained sophisticated networks of communication and relationship. Each new article he read helped him better understand the silent drama unfolding around his property. The evening brought new developments. As darkness fell, the security monitors captured images of multiple bears moving in coordinated patterns through the forest edge. Hope watched these scenes with unprecedented intensity, occasionally responding to distant calls that echoed through the night air. His reactions were becoming more vocal, more engaged, as if he were part of a conversation Ethan could only partially perceive. That night, as they sat in the living room, Ethan noticed Hope repeatedly moving between his comfortable bed near the fireplace and the window overlooking the forest. Each trip seemed to carry the weight of decision, of choices not yet made, but looming on the horizon. The cub's behavior reflected an inner conflict that Ethan understood all too well, the pull between safety and challenge, between comfort and calling. Before bedtime, during their usual evening walk through the mansion, Hope led Ethan to the room they rarely entered, the one that still held echoes of Ethan's past life. The cub sat in the doorway, looking first at the dusty photographs that lined the walls, then back at Ethan with eyes that seemed to hold profound understanding. In that moment, Ethan realized that both he and Hope were wrestling with questions of belonging, of identity, of what it meant to honor both the past and the future. As they settled in for the night, new sounds drifted through the mountain air, calls that seemed to carry messages of increasing urgency. Hope listened from his place beside Ethan's bed, his responses more confident now, more certain. The change in his young companion both warmed and worried Ethan's heart, for he recognized in Hope's growing awareness the first steps of a journey that might lead the cub away from the safety they had built together. The transition from March to April brought subtle changes to the mountain landscape. Patches of green began emerging through the melting snow, and the air carried hints of spring's awakening. Inside the mansion, Ethan noticed Hope's growing fascination with these changes. The bear cub spent hours watching the transformation outside, his behavior suggesting he was connecting to rhythms deeper than their daily routine. Their morning walks had evolved into more complex explorations. Hope no longer followed Ethan's lead, but instead guided them along specific paths, stopping at particular trees and locations that seemed to hold special significance. At each stop, the cub would investigate marks and scents with increasing sophistication, his actions suggesting he was both learning and responding to messages left by the mysterious visitors. One crisp morning, as they followed Hope's chosen path, Ethan witnessed something extraordinary. The cub approached a newly marked tree and, after careful investigation, rose on his hind legs to add his own marks to the existing pattern. The action was deliberate, confident, not the random scratching of a playful cub, but the conscious communication of a bear beginning to understand its place in a larger community. The security cameras continued to capture increasing activity around the property, but the nature of these visits had changed. The mysterious bears no longer seemed to be merely observing or marking territory. Their movement suggested purpose, as if they were creating a network of communication centered around the mansion. Each night brought new patterns, new messages etched in bark and earth. Hope's responses to these nocturnal visitors grew more complex. He would sit for hours by different windows, tracking movement in the forest with an intensity that spoke of recognition and understanding. Sometimes he would emit soft vocalizations that seemed to mirror the calls from the forest, as if practicing a language he was slowly remembering. Inside the mansion, signs of Hope's development were everywhere. His play had evolved from simple games to more complex activities that mimicked behaviors Ethan recognized from his research. The cub would gather objects, branches, pine cones, leaves, arranging them in patterns similar to those they found outside. Each arrangement seemed more deliberate than the last, suggesting Hope was not just copying, but creating his own messages. During their afternoon routines, Ethan observed new layers of sophistication in Hope's behavior. The cub had developed specific responses to different animal sounds, showing particular interest in the calls of ravens that seemed to serve as messengers between the forest and the mansion. Hope would watch these birds intently, his reactions suggesting he understood their role in the wider communication network developing around their home. The security system captured an intriguing scene one evening. A large bear approaching the property line, depositing something on the ground before retreating into the forest. The next morning, during their walk, Hope led Ethan directly to the spot. There, they found a perfectly formed honeycomb, still fresh and fragrant. Hope looked at it, then at Ethan, his eyes conveying a message that seemed to bridge their two worlds. As evening approached, Hope's behavior took on new patterns. He began performing what appeared to be deliberate routines, moving between specific windows, marking certain spots in the garden during their walks, responding to distant calls with increasing confidence. Each action seemed part of a larger dialogue, a conversation that flowed between the mansion and the forest. That night, as they sat in the study reviewing security footage, Ethan noticed Hope's attention fixed on something beyond the camera's view. The cub's posture was alert, but not tense, suggesting recognition rather than alarm. On the monitor, shadows moved with purpose through the trees, their patterns more organized than ever before. Hope watched these movements with what appeared to be understanding, occasionally glancing at Ethan as if trying to share his knowledge. Before bed, during their final walk through the mansion, Hope led them to the music room, a space they rarely visited. The cub approached the grand piano, pressing a paw gently against its polished surface. The action triggered a soft note that resonated through the room. Hope listened intently, his head tilted in a way that reminded Ethan of how the cub responded to calls from the forest. In that moment, Ethan realized that music, like the bear's communications, was another language that transcended ordinary boundaries. As they settled into their nighttime routine, new sounds drifted through the mountain air, a symphony of calls, movements, and responses that seemed to weave the mansion into the forest's nocturnal conversation. Hope listened from his place near Ethan's bed, his responses more nuanced now, more integrated into the wider dialogue. The change in his young companion spoke of growth and awakening, of a consciousness expanding to embrace both the security of their shared home and the mystery of his wild heritage. As April progressed, the mountain air grew warmer, carrying with it the sweet scent of awakening earth and new growth. The transformation of the landscape seemed to mirror the changes in Hope, who had grown not just in size but in his awareness of the world beyond the mansion's walls. Ethan watched these changes with a mixture of pride and unspoken concern, sensing that each day brought them closer to an inevitable crossroads. The morning sun painted long shadows across the mansion's floors as Hope led their daily inspection of the property. The cub's movements had become more purposeful, each step carrying the confidence of growing understanding. They stopped at familiar markers, trees scarred with complex messages, spots where the earth had been deliberately disturbed, places where offerings of forest treasures appeared mysteriously overnight. During one such morning walk, Hope demonstrated a behavior that left Ethan momentarily breathless. The cub approached a newly marked tree and with deliberate precision began adding to the existing patterns. But this time, his markings weren't mere imitation. They formed a distinct sequence, a response to the messages left by the nocturnal visitors. Ethan recognized this as a significant milestone in Hope's development, a clear sign that the cub was not just learning, but actively participating in the forest's dialogue. Inside the mansion, evidence of Hope's evolving nature appeared in subtle ways. His favorite resting spots now aligned with windows offering the clearest views of the forest. He arranged his toys in patterns that mimicked the communication markers outside, creating a bridge between his domestic comforts and wild heritage. Even his playtime had transformed, becoming more focused on activities that seemed to prepare him for something beyond their shared routine. The security cameras captured increasingly complex interactions at the property's edge. What had once been solitary bears making brief appearances had evolved into coordinated movements involving multiple animals. They appeared to be working together, creating elaborate patterns of tracks and signs that spoke of organization and purpose. Hope watched these recordings with intense focus, his reaction suggesting he understood far more than Ethan could comprehend. One afternoon, as storm clouds gathered over the mountains, Hope's behavior shifted dramatically. He moved from window to window with unusual urgency, his attention fixed on something moving through the forest. The security monitors showed nothing unusual, but Hope's agitation suggested he perceived events beyond the camera's reach. His vocalizations changed too, becoming more complex, more musical, almost like a conversation carried on the wind. The rain, when it came, brought with it new activity around the mansion. The security system captured images of bears moving through the downpour, their actions purposeful despite the weather. Hope watched from the safety of the study, responding to distant calls that barely registered above the storm's rhythm. Each flash of lightning illuminated scenes of wild activity that seemed to draw Hope's attention ever more strongly toward the forest. That evening, as the storm settled into a gentle rain, Ethan found Hope in the music room again. The cub sat before the piano, occasionally pressing keys in a pattern that seemed to mirror the rhythm of the forest's calls. The random notes gradually evolved into a sequence that repeated with purpose, as if Hope were trying to translate between two worlds, the structured harmony of human music and the raw symphony of the wilderness. The security monitors displayed new developments as night fell. The bears outside had begun leaving more elaborate signs, not just marks on trees and ground patterns, but arrangements of objects that spoke of intelligence and intention. Branches woven into complex shapes, stones placed in circular patterns, offerings of forest bounty left at regular intervals around the property. Hope studied each new discovery with growing comprehension, his responses becoming more confident and assured. Before bed, during their nightly walk through the mansion, Hope led Ethan to the room they had often avoided, the one that held memories of his past life. But this time, instead of remaining in the doorway, Hope entered the room and approached the photographs on the wall. He studied them with an intensity that suggested understanding, then turned to Ethan with eyes that held both wisdom and compassion. In that moment, Ethan realized that Hope's growth wasn't just about connecting with his wild heritage. It was about helping both of them bridge the gaps between loss and healing, between past and future. As they settled in for the night, the forest's symphony seemed louder, more insistent. Hope's responses had evolved into complex vocalizations that matched the rhythms from outside. Each call and response felt like another thread in a tapestry of communication that was growing more intricate with each passing day. Ethan lay awake, listening to this exchange, understanding that their peaceful routine was gradually transforming into something deeper and more challenging than he had ever anticipated. Spring had fully awakened in the mountains, bringing with it a surge of new life and activity around the mansion. The transformation of the landscape mirrored the profound changes taking place in Hope's behavior. The once playful cub now moved with the growing awareness of his true nature, each day bringing new signs of his deepening connection to the wild world beyond the mansion's protective walls. The morning began differently than usual. Instead of their normal routine, Hope stood at the back door, his entire body tense with anticipation. The security cameras had captured extraordinary activity overnight. Multiple bears had appeared, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested purpose rather than random wandering. Their tracks formed elaborate circles around the property, and fresh claw marks on trees seemed to convey urgent messages. Ethan noticed Hope's unusual agitation as they began their morning walk. The cub's movements were charged with energy, his attention constantly drawn to the forest's edge. As they approached the eastern boundary of the property, Hope suddenly stopped, rising on his hind legs to better view something in the distance. Through the trees, Ethan caught glimpses of movement, shadows that seemed more purposeful than ever before. The security system began picking up increased activity throughout the day. Bears appeared more frequently, their behavior suggesting they were no longer just observing, but actively trying to establish contact. Hope's responses to these appearances became more pronounced, his vocalizations matching the complex calls that echoed through the forest with increasing frequency. During their afternoon exploration, Hope led Ethan to a clearing they hadn't visited before. The area was marked with fresh signs of bear activity. Broken branches arranged in patterns, fresh claw marks on trees, and what appeared to be deliberate clearings in the underbrush. Hope moved through this space with remarkable purpose, investigating each mark and adding his own contributions to the silent conversation written in bark and earth. Back inside the mansion, Hope's behavior took on new urgency. He moved restlessly between windows, his attention focused on the forest with an intensity that spoke of recognition and longing. The cub's toys lay forgotten as he spent hours watching the tree line, responding to calls that grew more frequent and insistent as the day progressed. The security monitors captured a significant moment that evening. A large bear emerged from the forest, moving with deliberate grace toward the property's edge. Unlike previous visitors, this bear showed no hesitation or fear. It stood at the boundary, rising to its full height, and let out a call that seemed to carry both authority and invitation. Hope's response was immediate and profound, a mixture of excitement and what appeared to be recognition. That night, the forest came alive with activity. The security cameras recorded multiple bears moving in coordinated patterns around the mansion's perimeter. Their behavior suggested they were no longer just leaving messages, but actively seeking response. Hope watched these developments with unprecedented focus, his reaction suggesting he understood the significance of what was unfolding. In the study, reviewing the security footage, Ethan noticed something remarkable. The bears outside weren't just moving randomly. They were creating elaborate patterns of movement, almost like a dance. Hope sat beside him, completely absorbed in the images on the screen, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed to match the rhythm of the forest's communication. Before bed, during their final walk through the mansion, Hope led them to the music room once again. But this time, instead of playing random notes on the piano, he pressed the keys in a pattern that precisely matched the calls they had been hearing from the forest. The melody that emerged was hauntingly beautiful, a bridge between the structured world of the mansion and the wild symphony beyond its walls. As they prepared for sleep, the night air filled with an unprecedented chorus of bear calls. Each voice seemed to carry a distinct message, weaving together into a complex tapestry of communication. Hope stood at the bedroom window, his responses more confident and purposeful than ever before. The look he gave Ethan carried both love and a new kind of determination, as if he had finally begun to understand his place in a story much larger than their shared life in the mansion. The dawn brought a dramatic shift to the peaceful routine Ethan and Hope had established. As first light touched the mountain peaks, an unprecedented gathering of bears emerged from the forest edges. The security cameras captured what appeared to be a deliberate assembly, multiple bears moving with coordinated purpose, forming a semicircle at the property's boundary. At their center stood a magnificent female bear, her presence commanding and familiar. Hope's reaction to this gathering was immediate and profound. The young bear moved through the mansion with newfound urgency, his attention fixed on the assembly outside. His vocalizations changed, becoming more complex and assured, matching the calls that now filled the morning air. The connection between Hope and the bears outside was undeniable, a bridge of communication that transcended the boundaries between wild and tame. As Ethan watched through the security monitors, he noticed something extraordinary about the female bear at the center of the group. Her movements, her way of holding herself, even the distinctive markings on her fur, all suggested a connection to Hope that went beyond random encounter. The realization hit him with the force of certainty. This was Hope's mother, and she had finally found her lost cub. The morning unfolded with a series of remarkable interactions. The bears outside began leaving elaborate messages, not just claw marks and scent trails, but complex arrangements of forest offerings. Honey-filled combs appeared at regular intervals along the property line, each placement seeming to tell part of a larger story. Hope moved from window to window, responding to these signals with growing understanding and excitement. During their morning walk, Hope led Ethan to the edge of the property where the bears had gathered. Though the assembly had retreated into the forest, their presence remained palpable in the fresh marks and signs they'd left behind. Hope approached each message with careful attention, adding his own marks to the conversation. His actions were no longer those of a playful cub, but of a young bear beginning to understand his place in a larger community. Back inside the mansion, Hope's behavior reflected his growing awareness of the choice that lay before him. He moved between his familiar comfort spots and the windows overlooking the forest, each transition carrying the weight of decision. His toys, once the center of his attention, now lay largely untouched as he focused on the wild world beyond the mansion's walls. The security cameras captured more activity as the day progressed. The bears returned in smaller groups, each approach seeming to carry a different message. Some left new marks on trees, others arranged branches and stones in patterns that spoke of invitation rather than threat. Hope watched each visit with intense focus, his responses becoming more confident and assured. In the late afternoon, a remarkable scene unfolded. The mother bear returned alone, approaching closer to the mansion than any bear had before. She carried something in her mouth, a small branch covered in spring blossoms. With deliberate care, she placed it at the edge of the property, then rose on her hind legs, releasing a call that seemed to bridge the gap between her world and Hope's. Hope's response to his mother's call was immediate and profound. He rushed to the window, pressing his paws against the glass as he watched her. The look in his eyes spoke of recognition, of a connection that had survived separation and transcended the boundaries between wild and domestic life. His vocalizations matched hers, creating a harmony that filled the air with both joy and longing. That evening, as Ethan reviewed the day's events in his study, Hope sat beside him with an air of newfound maturity. The security footage showed the mother bear still maintaining her vigil at the forest's edge, her presence both a challenge and an invitation. Other bears moved around her, their actions suggesting they were preparing for something significant. Before bed, Hope led Ethan to the room that held memories of his past, the room they had so often avoided. But this time, Hope approached the photographs with new purpose, looking first at the images of family and love, then turning to gaze at Ethan with eyes that held both gratitude and gentle determination. In that moment, Ethan began to understand that their story was entering a new chapter, one that would test the bounds of their unique bond. The next morning dawned with an air of anticipation that seemed to vibrate through the mansion's halls. Hope's mother had maintained her presence at the forest's edge throughout the night, her vigil captured by the security cameras. Other bears moved around her in patterns that suggested protection and support, their behavior revealing a social structure far more complex than Ethan had imagined. Hope's response to his mother's continued presence was a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. He moved through his morning routine with distracted energy, his attention constantly drawn to the windows overlooking her position. His vocalizations had changed, becoming more similar to the calls from the forest, yet he still sought Ethan's presence with loving familiarity. As they began their morning walk, an extraordinary scene unfolded. A second bear emerged from the forest, larger than Hope's mother, approaching the property's edge with confident strides. The security cameras captured its powerful presence as it moved with surprising grace, but instead of showing aggression, it positioned itself protectively near Hope's mother, creating a barrier between her and potential threats from the deeper forest. Ethan watched in amazement as the two bears began what appeared to be a coordinated display. They moved in harmony, marking trees and ground in patterns that spoke of territory and protection. Their actions seemed to be creating a safe space, a neutral ground between the wild forest and the mansion's manicured lawns. Hope observed this display with rapt attention, his body language suggesting he understood the significance of what was taking place. Inside the mansion, Hope's behavior reflected the growing complexity of his situation. He gathered his favorite toys, the rubber ball, the rope toy, the soft blanket that had comforted him during his first nights, and arranged them near the window where his mother kept watch. The gesture seemed both a tribute to his time in the mansion and a bridge between his two worlds. The afternoon brought another significant development. The bears outside began leaving more elaborate offerings, not just honey and flowers, but carefully arranged collections of forest treasures. Bright berries, fresh pine boughs, and even small fish from the nearby stream appeared at regular intervals along the property line. Each offering seemed to carry a message of welcome and inclusion. Hope's responses to these gifts showed his growing understanding of bear society. He would study each new offering intently, then look at Ethan with eyes that held both love and a growing sense of purpose. His movements between the comfort of the mansion and the windows overlooking the forest became more deliberate, as if he were practicing the journey between his two worlds. As evening approached, the security monitors captured a remarkable interaction. A group of younger bears appeared at the forest's edge, their behavior playful yet controlled. They engaged in what appeared to be practice hunting and foraging, demonstrating skills that Hope would need to learn. Their presence seemed carefully orchestrated, an invitation to join their community while respecting the bonds he had formed with Ethan. That night, as they sat in the study reviewing the day's events, Hope's attention was divided between the security footage and Ethan's presence. The cameras showed the continuing vigil of his mother and the protective bear, their patience a testament to the strength of family bonds in the wild. Other bears moved through the forest in patterns that suggested preparation and anticipation. Before bed, Hope led Ethan through a new ritual. They visited each of his favorite spots in the mansion: the fireplace where he had first begun to heal, the music room where he had learned to bridge two worlds through sound, the study where they had spent countless hours together. At each location, Hope paused, as if committing every detail to memory. The night air filled with a complex harmony of bear calls, each voice distinct yet part of a larger chorus. Hope stood at the bedroom window, responding to these calls with growing confidence. His vocalizations had evolved into something that combined the wild eloquence of his kind with the gentler notes learned during his time in the mansion. The sound spoke of both belonging and gratitude, of endings and new beginnings. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mansion's grounds as Ethan and Hope began what they both seemed to sense would be a pivotal day. The atmosphere was charged with an energy that spoke of imminent change. Outside, Hope's mother and her protective companion maintained their vigil, their presence now a familiar sight on the security monitors. Hope's behavior that morning carried a new sense of purpose. He moved through the mansion with deliberate attention, pausing at significant spots as if saying goodbye to the space that had sheltered him through his most vulnerable times. His toys remained arranged by the window, a bridge between the comfort of his domestic life and the wild calling that grew stronger with each passing hour. During their morning walk, an unprecedented scene unfolded. As they approached the property's edge, the entire bear community emerged from the forest. They moved with coordinated grace, forming a semicircle that created a natural amphitheater. Hope's mother stood at the center, her presence both commanding and gentle. The protective bear positioned himself between her and a second group of bears that appeared at the forest's edge, maintaining the delicate balance of power. Ethan watched in amazement as Hope responded to this gathering. The young bear's movements showed newfound confidence as he approached the boundary that had always marked the limit of their walks. His responses to the calls from the forest were stronger now, more assured, matching the complex rhythms of wild communication while still maintaining his unique voice. The bears outside had created an elaborate welcome. Fresh marks on trees formed patterns that spoke of acceptance and protection. Offerings of forest bounty, honey, berries, and fresh fish lined the path that led from the mansion's grounds into the wilderness. Each step of the way was marked with signs that promised safety and belonging. Inside the mansion, Hope led Ethan through a sequence of moments that felt like a ceremony of gratitude. They visited the fireplace where Hope had first begun to heal, the study where they had spent countless hours together, and the music room where Hope had learned to bridge their two worlds through sound. At each location, Hope's behavior spoke of both remembrance and farewell. As afternoon approached, the security monitors captured a significant development. The protective bear that had been guarding Hope's mother moved forward, displaying impressive size and strength. But instead of aggression, his movements spoke of guardianship. He created a safe corridor between the mansion and the forest, his presence ensuring that no other bears would interfere with what was about to unfold. Hope watched these developments with growing understanding. His reactions showed neither fear nor hesitation, but rather a deepening awareness of the choice before him. He moved between Ethan and the windows, overlooking his wild family, his eyes carrying messages of love and gentle determination. Each gesture seemed to speak of his desire to honor both the bonds that had saved him and the heritage that called him home. The sun began its descent, casting golden light across the scene. Hope's mother moved closer to the property line than ever before, her presence both an invitation and a promise. She carried a fresh branch covered in spring blossoms, placing it carefully at the boundary between wild and domestic spaces. The gesture spoke of gratitude and recognition, acknowledgement of the care that had preserved her cub through the winter's dangers. That evening, as they sat in the study one last time, Hope's attention moved between the security monitors showing his waiting family and Ethan's familiar presence. His behavior suggested he understood the weight of the moment, the significance of the choice that lay before them. Outside, the bear community maintained their vigil, their calls a symphony of welcome and patience. Before nightfall, Hope led Ethan to the room that held memories of his past life, but this time, the young bear's attention focused not on the photographs of loss, but on the images that spoke of love and connection. His eyes met Ethan's with a wisdom that seemed beyond his years, as if trying to convey understanding of how healing could come from unexpected sources, and how love could bridge the deepest divides. The dawn painted the sky in brilliant hues of pink and gold as Ethan and Hope stood at the mansion's threshold. The morning air carried the sweet scent of spring and new beginnings. Outside, the bear community waited with patient dignity, their presence a testament to the complex social bonds that Hope would soon fully embrace. Hope's mother stood at the center of the gathering, her posture reflecting both strength and gentleness. The protective bear maintained his vigilant watch, ensuring the safety of this crucial moment. Other bears moved in coordinated patterns that spoke of welcome and support, their behavior revealing the sophisticated structure of their society. As Ethan and Hope began their final walk together, memories of their shared journey flooded through Ethan's mind. He remembered the frozen cub he had found in the snow, the gradual building of trust, the joy of watching Hope grow stronger with each passing day. Every step they took now seemed to echo with the weight of their time together. Hope moved with newfound confidence, leading the way toward his waiting family. His path took them past all the significant markers of their shared life. The spot where Ethan had first found him, the trees where they had played together, the places where they had watched the seasons change. At each location, Hope paused briefly, as if adding another chapter to the story of their bond. When they reached the property's edge, an extraordinary scene unfolded. Hope's mother approached, carrying another branch adorned with spring blossoms. With deliberate grace, she placed it at Ethan's feet, a gesture of profound gratitude for protecting her cub through the winter. The protective bear moved closer, his presence no longer intimidating but reassuring, offering a promise of continued safety for Hope. Hope stood between his two worlds, looking first at the family that called him to his true nature, then back at Ethan with eyes that held depths of understanding and love. His final gesture was both heartbreaking and beautiful. He pressed his nose gently against Ethan's hand, a touch that spoke of gratitude, affection, and the eternal connection they would always share. As Hope took his first steps toward his mother, the bear community began a coordinated movement, creating a protective circle around the reunited family. Their calls filled the air with a symphony of welcome and celebration. Hope's voice joined theirs, his unique tones carrying both the wild heritage of his kind and the gentle notes learned during his time in the mansion. Ethan watched as Hope was welcomed into his true family. The young bear moved with natural grace among his kind, already beginning to learn the complex social interactions that would shape his future life. Yet every few steps, Hope would look back at Ethan, his eyes carrying messages of remembered love and continued connection. Months passed, and spring bloomed into full summer. Ethan maintained his daily routines, but now with a different purpose. He kept the security cameras active, monitoring the forest's edge, not out of fear, but with hopeful anticipation. The bear community continued to leave signs of their presence, marks on trees, arranged branches, occasional offerings of forest treasures, each one a reminder of the bridge that had been built between their worlds. Then, on a warm afternoon, as Ethan walked near the river that bordered his property, he witnessed something remarkable. Hope appeared at the forest's edge, now grown and strong, leading his own family of cubs. The young bears played near the water's edge, while Hope watched with careful attention, his posture reflecting the lessons in care and protection he had learned during his time with Ethan. As their eyes met across the distance, Ethan saw in Hope's gaze the same wisdom and gentleness that had always been there. The young bear let out a soft call, a greeting that bridged their separate worlds. His cubs looked up with curiosity, and Hope seemed to share with them the story of the man who had once saved him, teaching them that love could transcend the boundaries between wild and tame. Standing there, watching Hope guide his family along the river's edge, Ethan felt a profound sense of completion. His act of compassion had not only saved a life, but had helped heal his own heart, showing him that family could be found in the most unexpected places, and that love, in all its forms, had the power to transform both the giver and the receiver. The story of Hope had become a legend in the region, whispered among locals and celebrated by naturalists who studied the unusual harmony between the bears and the mansion on the hill. But for Ethan, it remained something more personal. A reminder that even in our darkest moments, hope could arrive in unexpected forms, bringing with it the promise of renewal and the courage to embrace life once again. Dear listeners, if this story of hope, healing, and the extraordinary bonds that can form between different worlds has touched your heart, we invite you to join our community of storytellers and dreamers. Every week, we bring you authentic tales of transformation that remind us of the magic that exists in our world. Click the subscribe button to your left to ensure you never miss an episode, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story could be the next one that inspires others to believe in the power of compassion and the endless possibilities of love. Until next time, keep your hearts open to the unexpected miracles that life has in store.